today. I know all of us are really looking forward to this presentation, so I will hand over straight to Professor McHenry to begin his presentation. Thank you.
谢谢 Jackie. Okay. Well, some of it, of course, is empirically testable in the sense that if you do your stats well enough, you should get some idea of the strength of your observation. So I'd always say, look to your stats first and foremost, because if they're good stats, you should actually get a sense from them of whether or not this is some type of reliable inference, at least in terms of the stat itself and its assumptions about language. Let me be careful about that. So I'd say look to that first. But I would also say, this may be more controversial, that we shouldn't necessarily focus on stats and also statistical findings, because some of the hypotheses that you may develop in SLA, or any other theory for that matter, may be falsified by a single telling example. So even when you can only go to a corpus and say, you know what, there's only about 3,000 words here that's relevant for my research question because I need this particular configuration of metadata, I'd still say, look at those 3,000 words. Maybe doing stats on them isn't the way forward. But do try and check whether those productions actually conform with your hypothesis. Because if you find an utterance in context which is clearly acceptable, but it runs counter to your hypothesis, this utterance itself is potentially, in epistemological terms, worth its weight in gold. So I would always say, ensure that you have sufficient data according to the measures that you're using in order to make reliable inferences, but do not overlook the possibility that even very small volumes of data, especially for very precise questions, may yield very valuable results.
Communication. Today he'll be giving us a talk on how language is used to represent obesity in British newspapers. And over to you now, Gavin.
So the aim of the project was to examine the language around obesity in contemporary UK print media. And as I mentioned, to do that, we combined techniques from corpus linguistics with concepts from critical discourse studies. So some of the differences could be related to the differing discursive practices in the ways in which tabloids and broadsheets actually produce news. Of keyword generation, there are lots of different statistics that can be used to measure keywords. Of course, we use log likelihood for example, in looking at stigmatizing language. So we were interested in words that were used to label people with obesity and also describe and evaluate their actions and attributes that were attached to them in the discourse. So for that purpose, collocation was really helpful. So we have a chapter on that in the book. And the approach that we used was sort of inspired really, in terms of the framework, was inspired really by sort of a frame analysis. So that was a method devised by Entman to look at media texts, how media text frames certain social issues. And recently it's been applied in linguistic research as well, particularly in health. So by people like Nelia Kotako and Dima Atanasova and Elena Samino. And we use that approach to categorize the uses of the keywords based on qualitative analysis through concordance.
Especially I really like your title, Corpus Friendly, People Need This.
Yeah.
And today we are having Javier Pérez from the University of Vigo in Spain.
And it's a huge honor that Professor Pérez Guerra is able to speak to us today. And without further ado, I will hand over to you, Professor Guerra.
Okay, and yeah, I will try to illustrate by means of this continuum here. Yeah, what I call comfy grammar is the scope of, you can see here, the scope of, prototypical, unmarked clauses and sentences. This is the domain of, say, Rulli syntax. Okay, the first stage, when one wants to investigate fragments from an empirical, perspective is to, use a database of fragments. And for the purposes of this case study, we have used the whole written component and only a random 30% selection of the, spoken component of the corpus. So this has been the way in which we've been playing with a number of tags, and we have, compiled our database of fragments in English here. So we have two main types of fragments. Clausal fragments, sometimes with verbs, sometimes verbless, and I'll come back to this in the following slide. And phrasal fragments, which can be adjectival, adverbial, nominal, prepositional, etc. Search for, in the case of, for example, Y fragments, here you have the query. We search for Y in the platform, followed by a number of words, at least one word, and maybe two, maybe three, maybe four, and then ended in, with punctuation, which can be an interrogation mark, which can be exclamation or whatever. I mean, we have a reduced form, which is more economical in a sense. It may be more complex to decipher, it may be more complex to grasp, from a semantic point of view, but it is more efficient in a sense.
Okay, so it is my pleasure today to have Dr. Charlotte Taylor in this series of talks.
They have implications for what we should do. So the way that we frame something suggests particular actions to our audiences. And so this really leads on to the second point about discursive construction, which is, well, we need to have a reason for looking at it. And I think that point about the implications of what we do is the point. We want to know how particular groups of people, in my case, how migrants are represented, because it has these real world implications. What does combining corpus linguistics with discourse analysis do for us as researchers? And the most obvious answer to that is, well, it means we can look at more data. And this is absolutely true, very important. It means we can get a more comprehensive view of the discourse because we can look at more of it. But I mean, more interesting to me is the second point, which is that if we have different ways of looking at data, we can see different things, and so we're coming in from different positions to look at the same thing, our language data, and we may be able to see different aspects of the discourse through those different perspectives. Right. So if you've got these positive representations of people, they're probably not being labeled as migrant. They'll just be talked about as friends or, doctors or whatever else. So there's a really complex thing there, that what we're looking at is the instances where people are being identified as migrants. So I think that's kind of an associated issue, that we're getting a particular kind of discourse, obviously. So when we say looking at discourses of migration, we're looking at kind of discourses of overt discussion of migration, I suppose. So those moments where they're participating in overt migration discourses as an instance of self-representation are actually going to be quite a small subset of data anyway, I think. They're just not interested. They don't touch it. They don't go there. And so that's quite interesting. You get a lot more discussion, for instance, in The Guardian. So another centre-left publication where they're constantly engaging with these discourses which are being established by the right. And that's really problematic, because what they're doing is giving them airspace all the time and repeating those discourses, even though they're repeating them in order to challenge them.